Welcome back, everyone. The afternoon session of our webinar episode commences now. Now, for our next resource speaker, we are welcoming Dr. Jose Victor Z. Torres from the De La Salle University, a multi-awarded writer, Palanca Award-winning playwright and essayist. Dr. Jose Victor Z. Torres is a professor at the History Department of the De La Salle University, Manila, and Associate Director for Drama and History at the Bienvenido and Santos Creative Writing Center in the same university. He has a PhD and MA in History from the University of Santo Tomas Graduate School. A former researcher of the Intramuros administration, his book Ciudad Morada, a walk through historic Intramuros, won the National Book Award for Travel Writing in 2006. In 2012, he won a special jury prize at the Premio Tomas, the USC Quadricentennial Literary Prize essay category Premio Mabini for a non-fiction work about the University of Santo Tomas during World War II, which was published in 2013 with the title A Wartime Legacy, the University of Santo Tomas during the Second World War, 1941 to 1945. He is the author and editor of 14 books on drama and history. In 2014, he was awarded the Outstanding Graduate School Alumni in the field of history by the University of Santo Tomas Graduate School during its 75th foundation year celebration. Once again, for his presentation about the city of Manila at the outbreak of World War II, here is Dr. Jose Victor Z. Torres.
I'm Dr. Jose Victor Torres from the De La Salle University. I'm here to discuss with you an oft-discussed topic with regards to the Second World War, but I'm sure that if details come along, you would be surprised. You know that if you look at the story with regards to its small parts and everything, you would find that the narrative would become more interesting, or probably would be something that would tickle your historical imagination or your historical mind, or something that you can recreate, within yourself. Now, the topic I'm going to discuss with you is about the start of the Second World War. The title I have given it is To Become and Have Faith, Notes on the City of Manila at the outbreak of World War II from 1939 to 1941. Now, I have to be specific about the city of Manila here because we are just going to talk about Manila. We're not going to talk about Bataan, Corregidor, Lingayen, or whatever points. Now, although I would mention it in the course of my lecture, but I'd prefer that I would focus more on what happened in the capital, because you'd be surprised that there were many things that happened in the city at the start of the Second World War. Okay? So, it is ironic that the news of the start of World War II in the Pacific was received by Filipinos as they were beginning to celebrate a major festivity throughout the Catholic world. December 8, 1941, in the Philippines, December 7 in the United States, was the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. The procession of the image of Manila's patroness was already arranged and scheduled for that evening. And like any other religious activity in pre-war Manila, it was planned to be a grandiose celebration with a grand procession with the Immaculada Concepcion statue here that was located in the Manila Cathedral. The photo that you see here is a modern version of the Immaculada Concepcion, the Immaculate Conception, and the original statue was understood to have been destroyed during the Second World War. And December 8 that year fell on a Sunday. So the streets were filled with churchgoers for the early morning masses who braved the chilly December morning, made more solemn and joyful with the thought that Christmas was just 3 weeks away. So tatlong tatlo nga importanteng event, no, na involved ang pagdating ng giyera dito sa atin, no. One, of course, is the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, as I said. Second, that it was a Sunday. No, from what I understand, it was already one of the Advent Sundays, and of course, the anticipation for Christmas. No, 1 week na lang, and the Misa de Gallo, the Misa de Aguinaldo, is going to start. But the day's solemnity was broken by the shrill cries of the newsboys standing near the church patios or street corners, mingling with the pedestrians and waving early editions of newspapers that were printed that morning. Now, you have to understand, this was a Sunday. Wala masyadong dyaryo nung time na yun. Kasi normally, most of the newspapers would stop publication on a Saturday, no, para walang dyaryo ng Sunday. Tapos Sunday uli ang pasukan for the newspaper lang Monday. But in this case, the people were surprised so that all of a sudden there were extras coming out. So the Tribune, which usually stops publication for a weekend, no, although it already began, the Sunday Tribune at that time was already printing out extra copies of the big event that happened that day. And this was, of course, the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So you can imagine, well, the street corners being filled with people crowding around newsboys who would scream out that there's an extra Tribune, an extra issue of Tribune, announcing, of course, that Pearl Harbor was bombed. And of course, it meant already the start of the war. Thousands of miles and a time zone away, America's air and naval forces lay shattered at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii following a surprise attack by the Japanese. War had begun. For some, the news came as a relief after months of nervous anticipation. Nothing had been followed more closely in the news than the events in Europe as Hitler rose to power and eventually the Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Japan began the invasion of China, and as America struggled with the diplomatic negotiations towards countries under a growing threat of war. It would also be an auspicious time for the Commonwealth government under President Manuel Quezon. Now, very few people know this, no? Because by the time the Second World War started, the elections for the Commonwealth, no, with Manuel Rojas and Sergio Osmeña running for a second term, had just been finished in November 1941. So, as we all know, Manuel Quezon has just been elected president again, becoming, of course, the first Philippine president, whether it's Commonwealth or Republic, to be elected for a second term. And he was set to take his oath of office that December. But it was no longer undeniable that Japan would precipitate a war with the United States. And if this happens, the Philippines would be dragged into that maelstrom because of her strategic position in Asia and her special relations with the United States. With the support of his military advisor, General Douglas MacArthur, Quezon placed the entire country under a war footing by first forming the Civilian Emergency Administration. Later, the Philippine Army, which was already being trained at that time upon the formation of the Philippine Commonwealth, would be placed under the U.S. Army under the name the United States Armed Forces in the Far East, under the command, of course, of General MacArthur. Still, life in Manila remained normal. Before December 8, except for the nightly cries by the CEA volunteers of Ilaw Ilaw, as an amused populace hurriedly extinguished lights for the practice blackouts. The citizens also willingly followed the evacuation drills, where civilians were brought to safety, quote unquote, to the hills of Rizal province. Then the real news came of a war. In the early hours of December 8, President Quezon, who was recuperating in Baguio, was awakened at 3 a.m. by his executive secretary, Jorge Vargas, who informed him of the news that came over the radio. A few hours later, having of course already been awakened, Yay Panlilio, a Manila reporter, a Manila lady reporter, who was sent to Baguio during the week to cover a story, arrived at Quezon's rest house and asked if Quezon will issue any statements for the Filipino people about the war. Quezon wrote down what would become his first official statement at the start of World War II and handed it to Panlilio, who then sent it over the wire to Manila. It was a short statement of several sentences. The zero hour is here. Every man and woman must be at his or her post to do their duty assigned to him or her. Until the responsible authorities order otherwise, the people must attend to their affairs as usual. The main thing to do is to be calm and have faith. Let us place our confidence in God, who has never forsaken our people. That same morning, Quezon returned to Manila to meet with his cabinet on the plans on what to do in his country in the time of war. Survival became the question in the city of Manila. Church authorities postponed the annual procession of the La Purisima in Intramuros that was scheduled for that evening. Armed guards became a common sight on street corners. Panic buying became the household's wife's duty of the day. Noteworthy was the unusual increase in marriages as men were called to be enlisted and quickly sent to the front as soldiers. Evacuations began, and almost one-sixth of Manila's almost 600,000 citizens fled to safety in the provinces. It wasn't long before the early hours of December 8 brought the Pacific War to the Philippines. Japanese planes with the still unfamiliar red ball markings flew over Clark Airfield in Pampanga, Sangley Point Naval Yard in Cavite, Fort McKinley on the outskirts of Manila, and the other air and naval bases all over the country, and began bombing these military installations, reducing many of them to blazing ruins. The planes and other defenses that were to be used in the country were totally destroyed. As the dusk settled on Manila, the country was almost now defenseless from any attack by the enemy. Classes were automatically suspended the next day, December 9, following the news of the Pearl Harbor bombing. 2 days earlier, President Quezon ordered the ROTC cadets who were already on active military duty to return to their respective colleges and universities to continue their military training. One of these schools was, of course, the University of Santo Tomas. The activation of the ROTC was coordinated with many of the universities and colleges. In the case of UST, the Sulucan campus, as you see here, soon became a hive of military activity. The Philippine Army Transportation Section turned the parade ground, the football field today in the UST, into a garage for military trucks and other vehicles. Cadets from the Philippine Military Academy were brought down from Baguio by bus and brought to the main building, which they converted now into their barracks. Some Army engineers and Philippine Constabulary officers were also housed on campus. The offices of the ROTC were installed in the library and the adjoining rooms of the Central Seminary, and for several weeks, soldiers and military equipment were all over the grounds. Now, you have to understand the problem of UST at that time. Now, even though classes were suspended, now some of the colleges in UST, especially the Faculty of Medicine, decided to continue the classes. And this now would prove a problem, no, for the university. It was the decision of the university to continue, no, but as the campus was slowly converted, no, into a training ground, no, they of course began to disrupt classes, no, and of course many of the classes now were complaining, of the noise coming in from the different military barracks, no? The barracks and the tents that were built all over the campus. It would have been simpler to close the university and wait for better conditions. But Vice Rector Eugenio Jordan was troubled because the senior students were to graduate in 3 months. No, in short, malapit na gumraduate yung ibang medical students. No? He immediately wrote President Quezon to approve the automatic graduation of college students, especially those in the Faculty of Medicine, who still continued classes despite the closure order. This request was forwarded to the Secretary of Education, Jorge Bocobo, who wrote back on December 22, granting the request. The graduation of the fifth-year students was to be done on the first week of January 1942. Unfortunately, as we all know, January 1942 was the start of the occupation by the Japanese of the Philippines. Meanwhile, the third and fourth year medical students would continue their medical training at the Hospital de San Juan de Dios until December 21. So in short, the end of classes in UST would be until December 21. On December 18, Quezon is issued Executive Order number 386, circa 1940 series 1941, ordering that the colors of the Philippine flag be reversed with the red field on top to indicate a state of war, that a state of war exists. The order would read as follows. Partly read as follows. It's a tradition of the Filipino people that in the time of war, the flag shall be flown with the red stripe above and the blue stripe below in order to denote the valor, firmness, and fortitude which the Filipino people aim to prosecute such war to victory. And as you can see, the flag being raised here in Malacanang, you note here that the red field is up. Still the optimists harp. Newspapers churned out reports of victorious battles and enemy defeats. Victory, they said, would be ours before Christmas. MacArthur would lead a triumphant dinner on New Year's Eve. The talk of winning the war was still in the air as America abandoned her defenses in the islands in the guise of fetching aid and rescue. So as we were slowly being already abandoned, we were still quite positive that we would still win the war. There were mixed reactions. Christmas was approaching. For the innocents, it was a season of joy. There was still the tree to be trimmed, the gifts to be bought, and the banquets to be prepared. To the optimists, there was that enduring trust in their white brothers. What is there to worry about? What chance would the paper boats and planes of those slant-eyed or the Singkits, as they call them, stand against the steel might of the Americans? One would smile uncertainly on this, considering that several days before, the naval might, the naval and air might of the United States was already destroyed, and reduced to junk in the seas, in the harbors, and the airfields. Events in the following week turned for the worse. There were already Japanese landing forces in northern Luzon that arrived between December 8 and December 10 in the areas of Vigal and Aparay. On December 12, the first landings of the Japanese army began in southern Luzon, with the landings in Legazpi. The early days of the Second World War in the Philippines was a situation where the press failed in keeping the public informed on the actual state of the war. Sometimes victories would be published in the newspapers, no? But even the military would be surprised because such victories never happened because there was no shooting war yet. So it came as a surprise when, in spite of the headlines of victories, the retreat of the USAFE to a strategic defense line in the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island began. On December 24, 1941, the USAFE Command and the War Cabinet of the Commonwealth withdrew to Corregidor. Christmas 1941 was the gloomiest Yuletide season the Filipinos celebrated, as the uncertainties of war felt like a shadow over the city. The gloom became darker when the next day, Manila woke up to streamers being strung across major streets in the city, declaring Manila an open city, which meant that there were no more military targets in the city, and basically Manila had become a civilian area. The citizens could only stare in disbelief because it was only then that they realized the abandonment already being done in the country. That same evening, an explosion shook the fuel stores in Pandacan, leaving clouds of smoke over the city. The flames cast a red illumination on the horizon. It was later learned that the explosion was the result of an accident when a careless worker threw a lighted cigarette butt into a pool of gasoline as the army was draining the depot tanks into the Pasig River to prevent the Japanese forces from using the fuel. It was a common belief, no, that the army deliberately blew it up, no, but that is not true. What happened in Pandacan was apparently accidental. As authorities abandoned the city, discipline broke down. Looters began to break open warehouses in the pier area. It was the Christmas season and there was a heavy arrival of cargoes from abroad. Food and things that were ordered from catalogs from the United States and other countries were stored in these warehouses. Civilians raided abandoned stores and mobbed unclaimed crates at the ports. Manila policemen, earlier disarmed due to the open city policy, stood helpless or joined the looting as they could no longer stop the stampede. On December 27, in spite of the fact that Manila had no longer had any military objectives, Japanese bombers aiming for ships at the riverside, or so they said, destroyed the centuries-old Santo Domingo Church, the Santa Catalina College, the Beaterio de Santa Catalina, and of course the Intramuros Primary School. Several government and private buildings like the Intendencia, you can see it in the upper right, and the Colegio de San Juan de Letran were damaged, as well as other government and private buildings. Among the other buildings that were destroyed were the offices of the printing presses of the Philippine Herald and its sister publication, the Mabuhay, the El Debate, and the Monday Mail. And we all know it, of course, in our history as the DMHM building. The destroyed building you can see at the bottom picture on the right. But the destruction of the Santo Domingo Church wasn't the end of the misfortunes of the Dominicans. In the next 2 days, the Japanese bombing raids continued. Santo Domingo, which was still standing at that time, was now totally destroyed. The UST was partially damaged, and of course, the Beaterio de Santa Catalina also was totally destroyed. Colegio de Santa Rosa, which was across UST, was also damaged. On December 30, President Quezon and Vice President Sergio Osmeña took their oaths of office for their second term as President and Vice President of the Philippine Commonwealth, with Chief Justice Jose Abad Santos administering the oath of office. Quezon then broadcasted his inaugural speech by radio from Malinta Tunnel, Corregidor. By law, the other members of the Commonwealth government, the senior government officials, should have also taken their oaths of office in Manila to begin their functions in government. But the dire situation of the approaching enemy in the capital prevented this. The next day, the last of the Yusufe army was evacuated from the surrounding provinces and brought to Bataan and Corregidor, where they awaited the enemy attack. On January 1, 1942, New Year's Day, the Japanese Imperial Army marched into the city. That same day, President Quezon issued an executive order from Corregidor designated Executive Secretary Jorge Vargas, the mayor of the newly created Greater Manila, a new political entity comprising the city of Manila, Quezon City, Caloocan, Pasay, San Juan, Mandaluyong, Makati, and Parañaque. The mayors of the units comprising Greater Manila were designated as assistant mayors. And in 1942, with the formation of a new political administration in the city, Greater Manila was divided into 12 districts with Tagalog names. Intramuros was included in the Bagong Bayan district along with Port Area and Malate. As New Year 1942 dawned on Manila, the Japanese flag was unfurled on many of the government buildings. It was the start of the 3 years of enemy occupation. A postscript in the form of a picture. This editorial cartoon ironically came out on January 1, 1942, at the very hour the Japanese Imperial Army was already marching in Manila. It showed what the Filipinos felt for several weeks as the country was about to be occupied. The hope that America would come and help them. Something that would only come, unfortunately, 4 years later. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll be waiting your questions in the next few minutes. Maraming salamat po. Magandang hapon sa inyong lahat.
Thank you very much, Dr. Torres. For our last speaker for today, we have Mr. Joselito Ebro, a lecturer at the Yuling College, China. Joselito Ebro Jr. is an international teacher currently based in Guangzhou, China. As an international educator, he has taught Philippine and world history, geography, sociology, and art appreciation subjects in local and international schools. He is also a National Geographic Certified Educator, an Apple teacher, and a Google Certified Educator. As a scholar, he has written and presented research works about Philippine architecture and society. His MA thesis focuses on how Japanese-sponsored parades served as a propaganda tool during World War II. He received his undergraduate and master's degrees from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He is also a member of podcast, Conversations on Philippines History, Politics, and Society, to present as Parade as Propaganda, Japanese-sponsored parades in World War II Philippines. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Joselito Ebro.
Magandang araw po sa lahat. Ako si Joselito M. Ebro Jr. Magandang araw po sa lahat. Ako si Joselito M. Ang topic po ng aking presentation today ay tungkol sa mga parada. Ang titulo po ay Parades as Propaganda, Japanese-Sponsored Parades in World War II Philippines. Ito po ay hango mula sa aking MA thesis mula sa UP Diliman. At ang main question po or driving question ng aking papel ay how did the Japanese-sponsored parades contribute to the promotion of war activities by the Japanese? And I'd like to begin with a Declaration of Independence video back in October 14, 1943. Ayan. So, mula po sa video yun, no, makikita natin kung gaano kahalaga yung event na ito sa kasaysayan ng Pilipinas. At makikita rin natin kung gaano kahalaga ito para sa mga Hapones, para ipakita na malaya na mga Pilipino at sila ay generous, kumbaga, sa pagbibigay ng kalayaang ito. During the war, the presentation or showing of Philippine flag and the singing of the national anthem was actually prohibited. And those rules actually were implemented during the 22-month military rule. So, ayon nga sa mga reports, maraming naiyak na mga Pilipino nung muling winagawayway ang watawat ng Pilipinas, pati na rin yung pagkanta ng pambansang awit. At ayon sa mga reports din, sa mga articles, 500,000 participants joined the celebration. At gusto nilang ipakita na ito ay better representation than Commonwealth government or the declaration of the Commonwealth government back in 1935. Marami pong dumalo, including the veterans of the Philippine Revolution, government officials, employees, Japanese nationals, even third-party nationalities that were allied with Japan during the time, and the neighborhood association members or the DANAS members from different provinces. And Filipinos welcomed independence with tears and enthusiasm. Ayun po yung pinakita sa mga papel. Pero para sa mga dumalo sa pagdiriwang na ito ay made in Japan and no more than an empty gesture coming from the Japanese. In fact, the attendance was compulsory, and according to eyewitnesses, it was actually a false reception of the people. And indeed, it was a lesser version of the 1935 independence celebration. For Lichauco, in his book Dear Mother Putnam, he said that it was a huge joke, of an event. And from Buena Fe in wartime Philippines, he described the event as something like unimportant, as people were more concerned with the heat, difficulty of transportation, and even the mud on the ground, and only the imaginative reporter seemed to be serious about the affair. At alam naman natin yung mga imaginative reporter na ito ay mga alay din po sa mga Hapones. So, isa lamang ang Declaration of Independence sa ilang parada na aking inaral para sa aking thesis masterado. May ibang tipo rin po ng mga parada tulad ng mobilization parade. This happened during the end of 1942, early months of Japanese occupation of the Philippines. Isang military parade din ang ginawa noong June 3, 1942. And makikita natin dyan yung pagpapakita kung gaano kalakas ang armas ng Imperyong Hapon. And when Bataan and Corregidor fell, there was a massive parade organized by the Japanese, and this started the so-called commemoration parades to commemorate important events during the war from the Japanese perspective. Meron namang anniversary parade noong December 8, 1942 to commemorate the attack on Pearl Harbor and the start of the Pacific War. And then the fall parade again in April 11, 1943. Gratitude parade in February 8, 1943, which connects or relates with the independence declaration, as during this period the Philippines received a note from Japan that soon the Philippines will get its own independence from the Empire of Japan. And also the Thanksgiving parade in May 6, especially when Premier Hideki Tojo visited the Philippines. And this also marked massive publicity coming from a lot of newspapers, the media, and propaganda tools. There are also, we have covered the Independence Parade already, and also Tenkyosetsu Parade, some form of cultural parades na holiday sa Japan. It's the Empire of Japan celebrating major 4 holidays, at isa po ito sa mga 4 na iyon. So, ang goal or ang pinaka-take ng pag-aaral na aking isinagawa ay ang pagpapakita na ang mga Japanese-sponsored parades ay spectacles or spaces of propaganda to present idioms of unity, collaboration, and commitment to Japanese intentions. So, paano nga ba naging propaganda tool ito? So, ang parada ay isang public procession, especially one celebrating a special day or event. So, sa pagpili pa lamang po ng kung ano ang ipagdiriwang ay may bias na doon. And inside the parade, we can see it in 2 folds. There are practices in these types of events, and also the way it was being shown in the media. So, internal and external. So, mula sa parade programs, government documents, images, letters, announcements, memoirs of those participants, hanggang sa mga news articles, headlines. Balik lang po ako doon. radio coverage, images, feature articles, kasama po yan sa nagpapakita kung paano ba ito naging form of a propaganda. So, a propaganda, by the way, according to Jowett and O'Donnell in their book Propaganda and Persuasion, propaganda is a deliberate and systematic attempt to shape perceptions, manipulate cognitions, and direct behavior to achieve a response that furthers desired intent of the propagandist. So, ito ay parang machine or tool to enhance kung ano man yung goal ng propagandist. At sa aspetong ito, ang propagandist po ay ang Imperyong Hapon. So mula dito, maaari makabuo ng identity at kung saan ang propaganda ay nakakapag-shape or influence kung paano nga ba natin ipapakita sa mga tao ang mga mahalagang mensahe na gusto natin iparating. So noong Second World War, maraming nangyari, maraming parada ang isinagawa at ang mga ito ay, according sa aking pag-aaral, ay forms of spectacle na kasama sa Japanese cultural propaganda. Dahil ang mga mensaheng binuo nila or nabuo sa mga events na ito ay kabilang sa mga goals or aims na masasabi ng mga Hapones habang sakop nila ang Pilipinas. Ayon sa Bureau of Education number 2, ito ang mga bagay na dapat bigyang pansin ng mga Pilipino. Una ay to understand the position of Philippines as member of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Also, remove Anglo-Saxon influences or Western influences. Elevate the morals of the people. Endeavor the diffusion of Japanese language and termination of English in their due course. Stress the importance of elementary and vocational education and inspire the people with spirit of labor. So yung mga goals na ito ay makikita rin sa mga parada na ating tatalakayin sa mga susunod pang parte ng presentation na ito. So, staging of parades was actually part of the Japanese war on culture. So let's start with the first point. So from organization to execution, the Japanese were in direct control of the parade making process. So, makikita natin dito yung mga organizers ng iba't ibang parades na aking inaral, mula sa mobilization parade, army parade, hanggang sa Tenryusetsu. At makikita rin natin na karamihan sa mga organizers ay mga Pilipino. Pero hindi ibig sabihin po noon ay mga Pilipino or malaya ang mga Pilipino kung ano yung ilalagay nila sa mga programa. May programa na diktado or dinictate na rin ng mga Hapones. For example, George Vargas usually receive notes from Consul Quijara kung ano yung mga bagay na dapat i-prepare, ano yung mga bagay na dapat i-highlight, at even yung mga maliliit na detalye na dapat nilang ilagay sa mga paradang nabanggit. So, ang mga participants rin, makikita natin ang Philippine Constabulary, lagi rin kasama natin dyan yung Constabulary Band, government employees, since required nga ang mga events na ito, government-owned corporations, private firms, school children, kasi mahalaga ang mga bata to show na laki ng suporta ng mga Hapones mula sa mga Pilipino. May mga DANAS or District and Neighborhood Associations, Kalibapi, third-party nationalities, and even the general public. Isa rin sa mga tiningnan ko sa pag-aaral ng mga parada ay yung order and movement. So malaking bagay dito yung venue. And kadalasan sa Luneta yung venue. Iba pa yung pangalan ng Luneta noon. And day before the parades, lagi nang nakalathala yan sa mga pahayagan. So alam na kung sino yung mga sasama, paano yung order, saan dadaan, at ano yung mga dapat gawin ng mga taong nasa vicinity. So first, sponsored parades operated something like in series of system, born out of the organized framework set by the Japanese or the organizers. So, sentro ng mga parada lagi ang reviewing stand, okay, na nasa Luneta, kung saan nandun yung mga highest Japanese officials at nandun din lagi yung parade stations after they paraded and show support to the Japanese. So, in terms of order, laging nauuna ang constabulary unit, constabulary band, members of the executive commission, the members of celebration committees, National Council of State, and the Chief Justice. So, laging una yung mga matataas na miyembro ng pamahalaan. At laging yung programa na sa mga paradang ito ay iisa yung ginagawa, no? For example, yung laging salute to the members of the Japanese Imperial Army, singing of the Kimigayo, paying homage to the Imperial Palace, 1-minute silent prayer, laging may speech din from a Filipino representative. At in special events, may public resolutions. It was during the time of Tojo na may mga resolutions na ginawa to show infinite or eternal support of Filipino people to Japanese intentions. Speech by Japanese representative, constabulary band number, sa parada rin in-announce yung Kalibapi, and hindi rin nawawala yung radio taiso performance ng mga participants, and it ends usually with 3 cheers of Bansai. So another thing, parades operated to manipulate people's expectations by subjecting participants to habits, rituals, and special events. So speaking of the radio taiso performance, laging kasama yon sa mga parada, at madalas ginagamit rin ng mga Hapones or ginagamit ng mga organizers ang mga parada upang makapagbigay ng serbisyo, no, sa mga tao. For example, laging free yung transportation during that day or during that event. Minsan nagbibigay rin sila ng mga free movies, band concerts, nagpapa-competitions din sila. Minsan pagandahan rin ng Japanese flags, and lagi may mga radio speeches din to complement kung ano man yung pinagdiriwang nila on that day. And for the rules and policies, like I mentioned earlier, laging required ang attendance. Dapat rin laging may Japanese flags. Before the declaration of the independence, bawal na bawal ipakita yung ang watawat ng Pilipinas. So laging Japanese flag lang ang hawak ng mga Pilipino. Lagi ring may placards, and behavior should actually be checked and in fact managed by the supervisors na meron lagi sa bawat grupo ng mga participants na ito. So habits like saluting, bowing, the 3 cheers of Banzai, silent prayer, radio taiso, communal singing, and use of flags, dapat sabay-sabay or dapat at least pare-pareho at in unison yung mga events or activities na ito. At nalaging kasama rin po yan sa mga parada. And then after the parades, laman din po ng mga pahayagan yan usually. For many, it was mostly exaggerated yung mga headlines. For example, 500 people daw yung dumating sa Declaration of Independence parade, pero sabi nung ilang mga nakasaksi, hindi naman 500,000, yung mga 50,000 lang yun. And then images emphasizing how many people were or how many people participated the event, radio coverage, numbers, and usually appeal to emotion. For example, yung writer nitong Declaration of Independence parade, talagang napaka-vivid ng description niya. Sabi niya nakita niya yung isang participant daw na sobrang naluha Okay, naluha nung itaas daw yung watawat ng Pilipinas during that day. So yung mga ganong trick to show na suportado ng mga Pilipino yung mga Hapones during that time. Also, parades were utilized as venues to promote the Empire of Japan and its intentions for Filipinos. So, sa mga parada, malaking or kapansin-pansin yung pagpapakita ng lakas, particular dun sa military parades ng mga Japanese. So, sponsor parades presented the empire as victorious, seen from the following. First, the timing of parade. Kapag nananalo yung mga Japanese, meron agad parada yan to celebrate. Presentation of military strength, showing of confidence in early successes of Japanese in the war, declaration of support from Filipino people, and the acceptance of Japanese practices and rituals. So, napaka-obedient ika nga ng mga Pilipino. And they are very supportive of Japanese intentions. That's why they are joining these types of events. The Japanese also, through parades, painted a corrupt image of Americans, particularly sa mga speeches. Iisa yung mensahe na sinasabi ng mga nagsasalita during the parade program. For example, they usually painted an image of the US as weak and had no chance of winning or being victorious in the war. They also emphasized cutting of ties from countries or Western countries and the removal of any Western influences. So, lagi nilang sinasabi dyan na kalimutan na natin yung Estados Unidos. Iniwan kayo niyan eh. Diba? And kadalasan din yung mga, for example, during the fall parade, sabi nung mga speakers na may evil intentions naman talaga yung mga Westerners, especially Americans, and they corrupted the minds of the young to support their war against the Japanese. Kapansin-pansin din dito na yung Japan served as the surgeon, no? Removing American influence from the Filipinos, na isang malaking sakit sa mga Pilipino during that time, according to Japanese perspectives. Okay. And then the Japanese emphasized that the missing ingredient in the rebuilding process of the Philippines is their Oriental past. So kalimutan ng mga Western influences, balik tayo sa sinimulan ninyo. Yun yung gustong ipakita ng mga Hapon. To reorient Filipino values ingrained in speeches of the Japanese and sometimes Filipino officials. Promotion of Filipino, that they belong to this universal brotherhood or the Hako Ityu, practicing of the spirit of the East, emphasizing frugality, industry, or hard work. For example, in the speech of General Hayashi of the JMA, superior blood of the Oriental people should regain the essential qualities of their Oriental past, and they are present to support such type of attitude. And then lastly, Filipinos did not work as mere receivers of propaganda. Fortunately, Filipinos, hindi sila nag-work or nag-operate something like robots, at willing sila to do something and share something kung ano nga ba talaga yung nangyari. For example, in Buena Fest Wartime Philippines, he did mention that during one of the events, so pansin-pansin na maraming tao talaga kasi parang sinali nila yung mga neighborhood associations. So the crowd was estimated 400,000. Pero sabi ni Benafe, hindi naman yan lalagpas ng hindi yan aabot ng 400,000. In fact, it's only 50,000. And then also Victor Buencamino, in his book Manila Under Japanese Occupation, described that newspapers, a lot of onlookers were forced to participate. No? These onlookers did not applaud the troops. Men, women, and even children looked grimly and sadly. Different kung paano sinulat yung mga artikulo patungkol sa mga paradang ito. na sinasabing ang saya ng mga tao, naiiyak pa yung mga tao at very active yung participation nila. And then in Hilario Soriano's book, Japanese Occupation of the Philippines, maganda yung exchange na ito, no? Sabi kasi ng isang Filipino official, I think there's little doubt that the great majority of the people are pro-Japanese. I should say that 90% of them at least understand the true objectives of Japan fighting for the greater East Asia. And then the Japanese officer answered, "You are mistaken. I'm afraid that 45% of population continues to be pro-American. 5% are pro-Japanese, while the remaining 50% are comedians." Because during the parade, alam naman nila na marami sa mga Pilipino ang nagkukunwari lang at napipilitang sumali sa mga ganitong event. So, overall, these events, the Japanese-sponsored parades, from organization to execution, practices and habits, and even the images presented, they operated as venues of propaganda, aimed to present Filipinos as obedient polity, willing to collaborate with the empire, different from its intentions. These events paraded the Empire of Japan instead of representing an image of the Filipino nation. So, yun lang po. Marami pong salamat. Medyo napahaba ang aking pagtalakay. At kung may mga katanungan po kayo, maaari niyo pong itong itanong sa mga susunod pang parte ng ating webinar. Marami pong salamat at ingat po lagi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ebro. We are now opening the floor for the questions from the audience and the public. Now, for our FB viewers, please place your questions on the comment section. And for the Zoom participants, please place your questions on our chat box. And please indicate as well to whom you would like your questions be addressed. So we already have some questions here. And for those of our research speakers, you may now open your cameras. For our first question, this is for Dr. Danilig. Now, with the current fight regarding disinformation, can you suggest ways on how we can fight false information about the legacy of Jose P. Laurel during the Japanese occupation? Dr. Danilig? Let me just repeat the question for... All right, let's just move to the next question. This is for Mr. Sarmiento. Didn't the epidemic condition of the Philippines by the time of occupation brought any fear or threat in terms of health condition for the Japanese forces?
Hello, ma'am. Yes, yes, ma'am. Aside from the threat among the Filipinos, there's also a threat coming from the Japanese. That's why yung response nila dun sa mitigation at the same time prevention of the calamity, sila muna yung inuunang bigyan ng mga gamot before the Filipinos. So it's also serve as a threat during that time, the epidemics.
Thank you so much, sir. Go back to the first question. So to Dr. Danilig, ma'am. With the current fight regarding disinformation, can you suggest ways on how we can fight false information about the legacy of Jose P. Laurel during the Japanese occupation? Sorry, ma'am, but we cannot hear you. You're currently on mute. Yeah. We can still hear you both for a while. Okay po. So I think while Dr. Danilig is trying to fix her audio, let's move on to our next question. Now, this is from Chris Pascual, and this question is for Dr. Torres. Now, in your lecture, sir, you mentioned that the burning of the Pandacan oil depot was a result of an accident, contrary to the notion that it was deliberately done. Now, related to this, was there any organized scorched earth actions implemented in Manila as the Philippine government evacuated the city?
I don't think there was any policy of a scorched earth, no, because um, for one thing, as early as December, MacArthur was already pulling out the military from the city, no, and he was already enforcing War Plan Orange, in which they were anticipating that the Americans would help them. No, so by the time anything was done and the realization that the help wasn't even coming, it was only then, no, that that any idea of scorched earth actually would no longer happen, because there was already, I don't know, they were not actually already I won't say ready. They were actually I think it wasn't in their mind actually to burn down the entire city. So, because remember, unlike what we can imagine from what happened in Russia or in whatever Europe, no, that scorched earth policy is enforceable. Medyo ang scorched earth is ano na yan eh, ancient history na yan eh. That you burn down an entire city just for no, just for the sake of not supplying anything to the enemy. Yeah? And besides, as we all know, as we even read in our history, no, we were unprepared for the no, for the war that was going to happen, and I don't think there wasn't in any mind by any of the officials, including Quezon or even MacArthur, that they would make the people suffer more for what would have apparently happen if they did enforce a scorched earth policy.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for that response. Next question po. We have John Edson Marasigan Go from Facebook. This is for Sir Ebro. How many Chinese in the Philippines joined the Japanese army during the war daw po?
In terms of my research about the parades, there were actually less Chinese that participated in the parades, but in about their participation in the war, I think that's not part of the scope of my study.
Sir? Okay po, next question. I think this one is for Dr. Damili. Yes.
Do we
Yes.
need, yes, ma'am? Oh,
Oh, there's still no audio. That's
audio
okay,
po.
ma'am.
all right.
Okay, next question na lang po tayo. So, this is for Mr. Ebro, once again. What is the relevance of having Ricarte and Aguinaldo in the 1943 Declaration of the Independence?
That's a nice question, no? Because the Japanese wanted to paint a picture to forget the Americans. And one way for them to achieve such type of goal is to create something like an Oriental values for Filipinos. And one of those is yung mga pagpapakita na lumaban yung mga Pilipino against the Americans. And we know Artemio Ricarte and Emilio Aguinaldo were the leaders, no, of the revolution against the Americans back then. So it helped paint a picture and support the Japanese intentions on that part.
Thank you, sir. Next question po.
Sorry, can I also answer the question for Mr. Ebro? You know, for the World War II 75th anniversary, I did a paper between Aguinaldo and Ricarte, no? And one of the reasons also that the Japanese chose Ricarte and Aguinaldo, no? Yeah, Mr. Ebro is right, no? Because they were the symbols of the tenacity of the Filipinos, so to continue with what they have and not surrender to the Americans. It was also because Aguinaldo was the symbol of independence. Now remember, it was during his revolution that he eventually would declare Philippine independence. So of course later Aguinaldo would deny everything, no, and would eventually say na napilitan lang daw siya and everything. He was forced to collaborate and everything. And in the end, no, Aguinaldo actually was hesitant of being with Ricarte at that time. He had a very, very low disregard for Ricarte. No, because Ricarte was all of this boisterous thing and everything na mababait yung mga Hapon, no, magagaling yung mga Hapon. And of course, Aguinaldo's opinion for this was that it no matter what you do, preso pa rin tayo. Walang pinagbago. No? So yeah, to answer the question, yeah, they were symbols of the so-called independence. No? Which of course wasn't lost on the Filipinos, because eventually after the war, Ricarte would die fleeing from the very Filipinos that he was supposed to protect, and Aguinaldo would be arrested by Filipino guerrillas.
Thank you so much, sir. There's another question for Mr. Ebro. Do the Americans also use parades to garner public support during its occupation of the Philippines?
Well, in terms of the parades, no, in the United States, for sure there were, but I'm not very particular on the types or the specific details of that. But for the side question, maybe were there pro-American parades in the Philippines? I doubt there was any, no, or there was one. Because dito pa nga lang sa Pilipinas, yung mga pro-Japanese parades, bantay sarado na yan ng mga tangke. For example, in the Luneta, lagi may mga nakapaligid na tangke yan. Hindi lang nakikita sa mga pictures na naproproduce or napublish, pero bantay sarado yung mga participants. That's it.
Next question.
Thank you, sir. Let's go back to Dr. Damiling. Okay. All right, ma'am. That's okay po. Okay, moving on po to our next question. Now, there is a sorry about that. I kind of lost the question. Here, there is a common idea in our history wherein the outbreak of the Philippine-American War started during the weekends wherein many of the Filipino officers were away in the trenches or the front. Now, this led to the general retreat of the Filipino forces at the first part of the war. Now, in going back in the start of the Second World War in the Philippines, so did the religious celebration hinder the mobilization of the Filipinos for war, which may have led to the early defeats with the Japanese forces on land and air battles? So I think this question is for Dr. Todd.
Nasisi pa yung simbahan no? But no, just probably to give you the idea, no? Remember that the military was already on a war footing. No, during as early as the 1940, 41, there was already training and everything. And most of the religious festivities that were happening were handled by the ROTC. They weren't handled anymore by the Philippine Army, because remember, the Philippine Army was already always on a standby, no? And besides, there was still a problem with regards to arming the Philippine military at that time. So the degree of unpreparedness that happened with what happened during Pearl Harbor, tumiming lang talaga na December 8 dito eh. No? Remember, it was already December 7 doon. And there were much of the military, from what I understand, was already on a standby mode. But they were not necessarily all ready to go to a shooting war. No, they were, of course, still on a standby mode. As I said in my lecture, like a war footing na, but the war footing was very temporary. They weren't anticipating that they would go to war. No, and when the war did happen, of course, as we all know, MacArthur wasn't exactly the hero that everyone expected him to be, because in the first hours after the Pearl Harbor, he didn't place any of his defenses in the Philippines on alert. That's why nabomba sila lahat. They were all caught on the ground. No, kaya the unpreparedness was not because of the church, because they were all in religious festivities, but the unpreparedness was eventually caused because was of course, for me it was the ignorance of intelligence. It was the ignorance of military intelligence. Remember, there were and this has become quite a topic of a lot of conspiracy theories that Churchill daw already knew about Pearl Harbor. He didn't tell Roosevelt. Kaya daw because he wanted the US to be part of the war. That's all conspiracy theory, no? But what is definite is that the US was at fault because the intelligence was already there, no? But because of some mix-up, probably some ignorance and everything, hindi nila pinansin. And by the time by the time they were receiving the messages that Pearl Harbor will be attacked, Pearl Harbor was already attacked at that time. No? So there was really a failure of intelligence. We were, on all points, it was because of total unpreparedness.
Now, this question is for Dr. Sarmiento. This is from Sherilyn Sabling. Just a clarification, sir. You mentioned earlier that January 1, 1942 was the start of a 3-year Japanese occupation in our country. But on October 14, 1943 was the declaration of Philippine independence. Did we really gain an independence in 1943? So it's not a 3-year Japanese occupation anymore since the independence declaration in 1943. Thank you so much.
I think hindi ako yung nagsabi dun sa lecture ko, but I will answer. On October 14, 1943, it's just parang isang palabas lang na independence for the proclamation of Jose P. Laurel, it was published on the newspaper, it was celebrated, but again, it's just a justification na ibibigay sa atin yung independence sa pinaramis, remember ng mga American way back 1935. So nung dumating sila, parang sila nagtuloy at nag-promise na ibibigay independence, pero at the end of the day, it's just parang fake or not really authentic na independence since wala namang nag-recognize ng other nations dun sa on such declaration. Thank you. Yes, sir, Dr. Torres.
Yeah, just an addition to what Oman had said, kahit naman nag-declare ng independence, nakapaligid pa rin yung mga Hapon sa atin. Nandun pa rin sila nakabantay, for me, if whatever kind of independence that was declared, and I'm sure that Dr. Ebro would agree with me on this, ang isa siguro sa pinakamabuting nangyari nung independence in October 1943, pinauwi lahat ng Filipino POWs. Because all of these POWs were confined in Camp O'Donnell, in Capas, because they were considered still part of the US Army. That's why they were all confined in prisoner of war camps. Pero once independence was declared, or the Second Republic was declared, we were no longer considered as enemies. That's why lahat ng mga Pilipinong POW pinauwi sa bahay, hindi makakalain naman ng mga Hapon na pagka-uwi nila sa bahay, sumali naman sila lahat sa guerrilla. Inaway din sila ng mga taong pinaligtas nila.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Okay, next question po. This is for all of our speakers po. It says here, why should we draw our nationalism from the Philippine Revolution instead of the Japanese occupation? Anybody po wants to answer that?
But I think Sir Ebro would like to add something on the previous question. Go ahead, sir.
No, I just wanted to emphasize what Dr. Torres mentioned earlier about the POWs. Kasi nung sa Declaration of Independence, or yung event na yun, even during the event itself, sobrang dami ng articles na pinapakita na sobrang generous ng mga Japanese for doing it. Parang yung mga kaaway nila, pinapalaya nila. So itong event na ito ay parang malaking pagdiriwang para sa atin. So to show generosity, pero makita naman natin na it was inauthentic. Thank you, sir, for that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you po. Okay, yeah. Going back to the previous question po. Again, why should we draw our nationalism from the Philippine Revolution instead of the Japanese occupation? Anybody po who can answer that? Would like to answer that?
Ako, I want to respond on that question. No? Dapat natin makita ang kasaysayan hindi bilang isang tiyak na event lang, bagkos ito'y tuloy-tuloy. Kumbaga, kung kukuhanin natin yung ating pagiging makabayan or nationalism, it should be not just from the Spanish or Philippine Revolution, hindi lang siya sa American, hindi lang siya sa Japanese, kundi ang buong kasaysayan ay kumakatawan sa ating pagiging makabayan. So we should look into it holistic at hindi sa watak-watak na paraan. Gaya nga ng sinabi ni Salud Algabre, walang pag-aalsang nabibigo, lahat ay patungo sa tamang landas. So lahat ng mga pangyayari sa nakaraan ay nagpapatuloy hanggang sa kasalukuyan na siyang nagpapaangat ng ating pagiging makabayan. So hindi ko sinugot yung tanong na dapat ba sa Spanish pa, sa American, kundi sa lahat ng pagkakataon sa ating kasaysayan. Salamat.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks very much for that. Any additional response?
Insights from Sir Torres?
Yeah, para sa akin, lahat naman ng ating paglalaban para sa ating kalayaan, everything that we fought for our independence, was first and foremost the realization of our identity. And every time we fight for our independence, we are firming up the identity of who we are. No, I'll give an example that has been a point of contention. This usually involves the guerrillas that were part of the Second World War. Maraming inaargumento parate na sinasabing kaya daw lumaban mga guerrilla para pabalikin yung mga Amerikano, tapos napasailalim daw ulit tayo sa ating mga sa mga Amerikano uli. But I always have to explain to my students, no? You have to understand why the Filipinos continued to fight. We would have been satisfied under the Japanese if we wanted to, no? Or we would have been satisfied also for the return of the Americans. But you must remember, when the Japanese came, it was already 1941. 5 years na lang, independent na dapat tayo based on the Tidings-McDuffie Law. Di ba? Kaya lumaban talaga pa rin yung mga guerrilla. Remember, the Americans already surrendered. Ang nagpatuloy ng laban, yung mga guerrilla, because they believe that within those 5 years, America will keep their promise. That they will fight for our independence. That they will give us our independence. That's why we continue to fight. Now, if the Americans didn't return in 1945, we would have still fought on. No, and I think that bravery and that adherence, no, to what we believe was an independence that we deserve, no, that we deserve throughout our history, is something always that we should value. Hindi lang revolution, hindi lang World War II, hindi lang people power. It's talaga, each and every incident in Philippine history colors and give us form with our identity as Filipinos.
Thank you, sir. That's very well said. Additional insights from our speakers.
I just wanted to add to and support what Mr. Sarmiento and Dr. Torres mentioned, that it should be holistic. The way we see the past should be holistic, and there are unique qualities of events, and these events may actually contribute to how we view the past. And hindi siya mutually exclusive actually. Dapat hindi, sa tingin ko, hindi dapat ganun ang pagtanaw. Dahil maaari makapagbigay ito ng maling pagtingin kung ano nga ba yung dapat nating pagbigyan ng pansin sa kasaysayan. Ilan po.
Thank you, sir. Maybe we can go back now to Dr. Damilig. Still no audio. Okay. Let's proceed to the next question. This is for Mr. Sarmiento. The Americans were known in providing important health infrastructures in the Philippines before the Second World War. Did it provide aid in stopping the endemics during the occupation, and why?
During the transition period, since nag-withdraw na nga at umalis na yung mga Americans, so technically, wala na talagang napoprovide na help from the Americans in response to the pandemic. Majority of the help talaga, like the medicines, conventions, were sinasabi from the newspaper that it was initiated na by the Japanese occupation. Pero kung makikita nyo dun sa unang narrative tungkol dun sa malaria, di ba? Mas maraming yung namatay ng mga may malaria ang mga sundalo compared pa dun sa mga nasawi sa labanan. So with that, may mga reports na nagpadala ng tulong yung mga Americans in respond para makatulong dun sa mga sundalong nakikibaka, but hindi talaga na direktang naapektuhan yung mga Pilipino as a general na may mga malaria during that time. Thank you.
Yeah, can I add to what Mr. Sarmiento said? You have to understand that when the Americans left the Philippines, much of the offices with regards to government offices, so with regards to healthcare, education, and everything, were already under the Filipinos. Mga Pilipino na nagpapatakbo ng pamahalaan noon dahil sa Commonwealth. In fact, the Commonwealth was already 5 years, no? So whatever reliance that we had with regards to the Americans was slowly being reduced. That's why when the Americans left us, and to fight for ourselves, what it activated was actually some sort of I won't call it survival, the resilience of Filipinos now, how to deal with, especially sinabi ni Professor Sarmiento, tungkol sa mga nagkakasakit. So now you have heroes who were handling the medicines like Maria Orosa, who was inventing medicines and everything for the nutrition of while at the same time, of course, helping the guerrillas. And of course, the provision of using local products were eventually focused by the Bureau of Science. Kasi wala lang mga ang nagpapatakbo ng Bureau of Science, well, of course, the Filipinos. So every invention, every kind of medicine that was being invented, being done for the buti nga hindi nagkaroon ng major pandemic tama ako, di ba? Omad, buti hindi nagkaroon ng major pandemic, because if that happened, yari talaga tayo, madaming mamamatay.
Yes, sir.
Sinwerte lang talaga that some of the diseases that we were handling were malnutrition, so what did Orosa do? She got all the basic materials that could be found, local materials, and worked on it. Feeling ko, ito siguro wag nating kalimutan, lumabas ang kagalingan din ng mga Pilipino nung panahon na yon, because they had to survive.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for that. Okay po, next question po tayo.
Hello, could you hear me now?
Yes!
Oh,
Okay. Thank you. Okay.
thank you. Can we get back to the question that was addressed to me po?
Yes, ma'am. With the current fight regarding disinformation, can you suggest ways on how we can fight false information about the legacy of Jose P. Laurel during the Japanese occupation?
For me, I believe on the paradigm form, inform, and then transform. So as we all know, if we say form, we would have to obviously to form people. And today, the most proliferated, or shall we say, a tool or a platform that we could use so that we could inform people, it's the social media. So program as such, webinar as such, could provide us a platform to really give a story, to really educate people, to really inform other alternative stories. It's not just the discourse coming from the Americans, but also the pantayong pananaw of the Filipino people, so that we would know really, we could understand and appreciate those actions done by Dr. Jose Pasiano Laurel when he was the president of the Second Philippine Republic. So by doing such, we could transform the disinformation, if it's not disinformation, the misinformation of the people. So there.
Thank you, ma'am. Now here's another one for you, Dr. Damilig. Do we need Jose P. Laurel's brand of nationalism today?
I think so. The nationalism that he has, shall I say assertive nationalism, it's not just, loving our fellow Filipino, but not hating those other nationalities. So the brand of nationalism, especially it was pictured out when he was the president, not just when he was the president, but before the war, he actually exposed an active nationalism wherein he would have to enshrine the Filipino first, something like first Filipino policy, although we know that that's from Carlos P. Garcia, but in his presidency, in his hegemony, he has exposed that kind of nationalism wherein we would have to love our country, and by that we would have to help one another for us to whatever our goal would be, the freedom and the true independence would be obtained by our country. It's just that we had this, wartime, and we have these two warring powerful countries at the time, that it's very difficult. Although he struggled, but really persisted that we would have to work for our independence and for the freedom of our country.
For that elaboration, ma'am. Now, next to all our speakers, this is a follow-up question from John
Sorry,
Edson.
I'm sorry, can I add to what Dr. Daily says? No? I think one of the legacies that we can still continue today with Jose P. Laurel, that was that we also have to sometimes look at our history, at how Laurel involved himself in the post-war republic, in the Third Republic, no? Because
Exactly.
we have to remember that he was one of the authors of the Rizal Law, that he was the one who sponsored it when Recto introduced that in the Senate. And of course, Laurel was also responsible for the Laurel-Langley Agreement, because the Laurel-Langley Agreement would eventually reduce the provisions, the parity provisions that happened because of the Bell Trade Act. Of course, this is after the war and everything. But one of the things that I have to admit, I admired Laurel about it even before, was that Laurel was, even before World War II, was a very staunch nationalist. No, and he considered his principles of nationalism as something that would eventually be recognized or recognized by in the formation of the Filipino identity. That's why I think sila magkakagrupo niyan, si Recto, si Laurel, and eventually Laurel and Recto would give birth to the personalities of Lorenzo Tañada and Jose Jocno. It's because these people realized that what was important in every aspect of our country was that in order to know our country, they have to realize that what is a Filipino. And Laurel actually was one of the earliest nationalists who introduced that kind of thing, no? That how it is to be a Filipino. And no matter how much he was accused of collaboration and everything, no, he was supported by a lot of the people, no. In spite of his collaboration issue, he came out number 1 in the Senate elections
Yes, in
in the 1950s. No, so where was collaboration now? I think it's no longer the personality of the man, but on what the man believed in, and I think that what colored much of Laurel's life.
Yes, if I may
Thank you.
add, if I may also add, Doctor, Laurel, when he won the 1951 election, that's actually a vindication that really is not the puppet president as they were accusing by then. So by that time and onwards, 1950s, he was actually vindicated as someone that could be considered as a hero. and not as a puppet. Because collaboration is not equivalent to treason. So if you say, was he a collaborator and it equates to being a puppet? Of course not. He's not guilty of that. Okay. So I would like to inform our beautiful audience that hopefully the stigma of calling Dr. Jose Pasiano Laurel as a puppet president would be erased already, because he's not really a puppet due to those things that I have presented a while back in my talk.
Thank you very much, po. Next question. Now, this is from one of our FB viewers. This is John Edson Marasigan Go. This is still for Dr. Damilig. How many Chinese guerrillas, example po Iowa Chi, were pardoned by President Laurel? And can you please provide an example?
Sorry, could you come again?
One more time, ma'am. How many Chinese guerrillas were pardoned by President Laurel? And please provide an example.
I don't really have a data of, those Chinese guerrillas who actually who pardoned. They're being pardoned by Jose Pasiano Laurel, but I am sure that aside from Filipino guerrillas, there were also American guerrillas and even Chinese guerrillas. But to the question, how many Chinese were pardoned during his presidency, that I don't have the data.
All right, thank you, ma'am. Now, this is for all our speakers, still from John Edson Marasigan Go on Facebook. How many Makapilis fought the American forces and Filipino guerrillas during the Battle of Manila, and did they committed atrocities? Anyone can answer, po? How many Makapilis fought the American forces and Filipino guerrillas during the Battle of Manila, and did they committed atrocities?
Sorry, but I don't think any of our lectures covered the
We would know that
1945 Battle of Manila. So on my part, I cannot answer that question.
Yeah, on my part also, I don't have any data of how many Makapilis were there, but I'm very sure that the Makapili was headed by Artemio Ricarte, and I think one of which is Benigno Ramos, a leader of the Ganap also. So there.
Yes. Thank you very much for that. Now, for John Edson Marasigan Go from Facebook, unfortunately, it's not part of our webinar po for today. Next question po. This is from Mira Lotivio. Now, this is for everyone. How was the local government during the Japanese occupation? Anybody can answer? Once again, how?
I'll answer first. It was actually very amusing because in the case of the local government, especially in Japanese occupied areas, you have your local government sponsored by the Japanese government. Then of course, pagdating ng independence in 43, of course they were still under the Japanese and everything. But you also have a guerrilla country where they have also their own local government. So you have practically two local government officials trying to kill each other because one was each one considered you their enemy. No? Well, I think I'll give an example. In this case here in Cavite, when Mariano Castañeda became a government official here in Cavite, he ran the local government under the Japanese. But every time nighttime came, he would go to the hills and meet with the guerrillas. So the local government officials here in the Philippines during the Japanese period walked a very tight rope, no, because they were caught in between. They either had the choice of fighting the Japanese or joining the Japanese. If they join the Japanese, of course, they will be given rewards and everything. No, but the only problem was they will be killed by the guerrillas because they were collaborating. No, so yeah. How was the local government? They walked a very tight rope. no, because there were some local government officials who were had the appearance of pro-Japanese, but were in reality guerrilla supporters.
Yes, sir. And I would have to agree with Dr. Torres. But one thing also that I would have to add is that not all the local governments at the time, whether you are a governor or a mayor, was actually guerrilla or was actually, they were actually supporting the guerrilla, but they also caution the advancement of the Japanese military against the guerrillas, so that the peace and order, just like what Laurel and the other officers at the time, Claro M. Recto, Jorge Vargas, would have to do. They would have to caution whatever that's being done at the time. So it's not fair that we would have to say that the local government, all of them were actually against, or they were actually puppets of the Japanese occupation. So there were local governments at the time who actually cautioned, what's happening in between the Japanese and then those Filipinos actually resisted against the Japanese. But still tagged to be a guerrilla, even if they're not.
Yeah. Or on my part, about their participation in the parades, sobrang laki ng participation, especially those that are around the city of Greater Manila. For instance, Mayor Leon Ginto, maybe because the venue of these sponsored parades was in Manila, siya talaga yung very active. Lagi siya naglalabas ng leaflets, ng mga ordinances to support yung mga activities or festivities na ito. And one document or one thing to support the idea of massive support from these LGUs would be that happened during the time of the Victory Parade, nung nanalo yung mga Japanese at nag-fall yung for Edward Bataan. Halos karamihan sa second division nung sa mga nagpaparada ay galing sa mga LGUs, kasama yung mayor ng Manila, may Pasay unit, Parañaque unit, hanggang sa Caloocan unit na talagang nagpakita ng suporta dun sa event na yun. Napakita rin naman dun sa dun sa talakayan ko or yung sharing ko na hindi naman lahat ito ay suportado, no? Or hindi lahat ito ay pro-Japanese. May mga iba na napilitan lang dahil required sila to join these events.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ebro. This question is, I think, the last question that we have for this afternoon. This is for Mr. Sarmiento. What could we learn from the epidemics during the occupation in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic that we have today? Mr. Sarmiento, I'm sorry, but we cannot hear you. You can unmute please.
Hello, ito. Okay. Yan. So, ano ba? Muli, dun sa may mga polisiya na ginawa na noon na maaaring ginawa sa kasalukuyan. So maaaring yung mga hakbangin na pinatupad on the Japanese era will be a guide para sa implementation ngayon. Halimbawa, kayo na, diba, sinare ko yung konsepto ng mass testing. Makikita nyo na during the Japanese era, mas mababa yung number ng may mga tuberculosis. Hindi dahil mas mababa yung bilang nila, kundi kaunti kasi yung tinest. And alam naman natin, during the pandemic, lalo na nung kasagsagan, we are shouting for the idea of mass testing, pero hindi naman maibigay dahil parang hindi kailangan or what. Pero makikita natin dito na ang isa sa paraan para talaga ma-prevent yung pandemya ay magkaroon ng kaukulang testing. Kung sino talaga yung mga may karamdaman. So that is one way to look on that. Pangalawang aspekto naman dun sa konklusyon ko, yung pagtingin natin kasi sa pandemya or sa mga kalamidad na ito ay parang yung mga Pilipino during that time is pasaway or kaya nagkakasakit, hindi maganda yung kalusugan or the like. Ngunit hindi natin nakikita yung kanilang vulnerabilidad o pagiging bukas nila sa panganib, kung ano yung kanilang pinagdadaanan. So ganun din sa kasalukuyan, na yung pinagdadaanan ng mga Pilipino sa kasalukuyan sa pandemya, hindi dahil nagkasakit sila dahil mga pasaway sila or sila ay may hindi sumusunod sa mga protocol, bagkus meron silang pangailangan na kailangan matugunan na hindi maibigay nung nasa itaas, kung kaya sila nang tumutugon para mapunan yung mga pagkukulang. So that is how we can gain from that. Aside pa dun sa mga technical and scientific basis na. So maraming salamat.
Thank you very much po, Mr. Sarmiento. And that closes our open forum this afternoon. Once again, thanks very much, participants, for sending in your questions.
And thank you very much to our research speakers as well for responding to all our viewers' questions from Zoom and Facebook page. As we now near the end of our program, let us have the chairperson of the Department of Legal Management and Social Sciences, Mr. Christian Eligius A. Jimenez, for his closing remarks.
Everyone, and on behalf of Lyceum of the Philippines University and Dean Marilyn Ngales, we thank you for attending today's events. I would like to take this opportunity to also thank our speakers for sharing their expertise in today's webinar. We hope that you would continue to enlighten people on the history of the Filipinos, which is an essential factor in the process of nation building. Now, another day has passed, another milestone achieved. From listening to our speakers today, we were able to expand our knowledge and deepen our understanding of the history of the Philippines, especially during the American colonial period and the Japanese occupation. Dr. Damilig's exposition of the legacy of Jose P. Laurel Sr. presented a different side of Laurel as a nationalist president who asserted the independence of the Philippines and mitigated the atrocities of the war. Now, this is a fitting celebration of LPU's 70th founding anniversary this month. Now, Mr. Sarmiento's study, which revolves around the epidemics during the Japanese occupation, gave us an idea on how the Japanese took advantage of the raging epidemic during that time to advance their interest in the Philippines. Now, Dr. Torres' presentation in the city of Manila at the outbreak of the World War gives us a glimpse of the situation of the said city prior to the coming of the Japanese and the reactions of the Filipinos to the threats of the impending war in the Pacific. Now, finally, through Mr. Ebro's study, we learned how the Japanese utilized parades to manipulate the Filipinos in accepting the power of the empire in Japan and the Philippines, and the Filipinos' response to Japanese propaganda. Now, studying history is not simply looking at the past. In historical study, there is always a need to give meaning to these events and connect it to the present, since the present is a product of the past. Now, for us to understand the present condition, we must look back to the past and learn from it. Now, hence, that is what we call a fusion of horizon. Now, as we enrich our minds today of what happened in the past, we are being challenged to make the right decision, which could lead to the improvement of our current situation. We must transform ourselves from mere spectators of the past into an active citizen, which aims to create a better nation. Para sa bayan, para sa kasaysayan. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jimenez, for your message and, of course, your continued support. And go ahead.
And to finally conclude this episode of the Kagitingan Historical Webinar Lectures, may we have the PIVAO Administrator Ernesto G. Carolina for his message.
Let me first greet our special guest and lecturers today. Lieutenant Colonel Artemio Matibag, President of the Filipino-American Memorial Endowment. I'd like to greet Mr. Paulo Sotero Laurel, the Assistant Vice President for Non-Academic Operations of the Lyceum of the Philippines University, Manila. Dr. Angelita Damilig of the same university, History Department. Mr. Roman Sarmiento Jr. of the Far Eastern University. Dr. Jose Victor Torres of the De La Salle University. Mr. Joselito Ebro of the ULink College of Shanghai, China. And of course, our veterans, their surviving spouses, sons and daughters, and other stakeholders who joined today's webinar. A pleasant afternoon. Thank you for joining today's episode of the Kagitingan webinar. The American and Japanese occupation periods are among the defining moments in our history. It brought new sets of ideologies, reshaped our political landscape and educational systems, and most of all, brought out the strength and determination of Filipinos to pursue independence and cultural identity without the undue influence of foreigners. During the Second World War, Filipinos experienced violence and oppression. However, the Japanese invaders did not stop there, as they also challenged the Catholic Church despite its stand on the separation of the church and the state. As a country where religion and nationalism are tightly intertwined, the Japanese wanted to impose their own beliefs in hopes to gain full political, economic, and cultural control over the Philippines. Of course, this plan did not succeed, even with Japan's massive propaganda machinery using the local news and media. The Japanese failed to gain the cooperation of the Philippine Church, despite many attempts of collaboration. The predominant Christian upbringing of Filipinos served as a major roadblock to the Japanese forces. In addition, the Philippines sustained significant anti-Japanese guerrilla activities and resistance movements in different parts of the country, thereby hastening the liberation of the Philippines. Learning these bits and pieces of our history is essential to understanding ourselves better. It gives us a clearer view of how our forefathers and our veterans strongly stood their ground, fought hard, and sacrificed their lives to overcome the foreign invaders. These lessons are very timely today, especially since conflicts in different parts of the world are unfolding. These stories teach us that war can only amplify our differences and cause painful damage and divisions among countries. Thus, we hope that the conflicts happening today will not escalate further. As we close the second installment of the 2022 Kagitingan webinar lectures, may we use this acquired knowledge to gain a fresh perspective about our country's fight for freedom and a deeper appreciation of the independence and democracy we enjoy today. Again, we are grateful for your active participation today, and we hope to see you in the next Kagitingan webinar. Thank you, and God bless us all.
Thank you very much, Yusek Carolina. Now, once again, for those who were able to pre-register, we will be sending a link to your email. Kindly accomplish this evaluation form for your certificate of participation. You will receive your e-certificate after a day. Now, kindly check your spam folder in case it was sent there instead of your inbox. And for the next episode of our Kagitingan webinar lectures, Here's our schedule.
It will be entitled Visayas Island During the Second World War, and it will be on March 18, 2022, same time at 10 o'clock a.m. with our research speakers, Dr. Reiki Gonzalez, who will be presenting on this premiering Ilonggo Ingenuity in World War II Panay, Mr. Modesto P. Saonoy, The Battle of Patag and Lantawan, Occidental Negros. And lastly, Dr. Earl Jude Paul Cleope for the presentation on Negros during the war.
And we hope to see all of you next week for this episode. Now, before we officially end our program, may we now have our photo op together with our resource speakers. So I'm requesting everyone to please turn your cameras on for our photo op. There you go. Okay. We're ready. Okay, page 1.
Page 2, and the next, page 3, and last. And any parting words from our research speakers? We may start with Dr. Danlig. Ma'am?
Stay free. That's all I can say. Stay free. All of us Filipinos, let us all stay free.
Any parting words po?
Cerebro.
Maraming salamat at ingat po tayong lahat.
Sir Sarmiento po?
Ganun din, salamat at maging magiting kahit nasa gitna ng pandemya. Salamat.
And lastly,
Maraming salamat po sa lahat at tatandaan po natin ang kasaysayan ay dapat gamitin sa mabuti at hindi gamitin sa kamalian. Maraming salamat po.
thank you so much to all our research speakers. That concludes our today's episode of Kagitingan Historical Webinar Lectures 2022. We thank everyone for joining us this afternoon, and we hope to see you soon in the next one. I am Maga Grace Sahagud.
And I am Felice Lloyd Lanya. We have been your hosts for today. Once again, thank you very much and good afternoon. Mabuhay po tayong lahat.